hopefully you all stick with us for the rest of the afternoon. And we are moving forward now with a panel from two of the women that Judge Bartley actually called out this morning, Jillian and Peggy. And I believe I'm passing to Jillian first. They're going to be talking about moral injury and how to connect PTSD to service in unique circumstances. And so I'm going to go ahead and see, I think Jillian is on. And Jillian, are you able to share your screen?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
So we're going to go ahead and actually just, I'm going to do a really brief intro, and then we're going to toss it over to Dr. Mundt, and then we'll share my screen once we get a little bit further, and if that's okay. Just to give you a rundown, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's really exciting to be a part of this boot camp today. I was in a veterans clinic at my own law school, actually, at UIC John Marshall, and I really wish we had had this when I was in the clinic. So I'm excited as a practitioner and as a teacher and as a former law student. So I really hope that this is helpful to you all today. So to give you a little rundown, I'm not going to go through everyone's bio on our panel because you have all that information, but we are going to start with Dr. John Mundt. He is actually a practitioner and a mental health provider who is a wealth of knowledge. He's a wonderful presenter, and he's going to start by presenting a little bit about sort of the pre-VA side, when the person is still in service and what happens when they might go through a trauma. And then Professor Costello and I will talk about sort of what your job might be when you're looking at a claim for a potential PTSD or mental health condition claim, and how to help your veteran, and the VA side of it, which some of it might be a bit that you've heard about before, but we think it bears repeating. And then Dr. Mangold will finish off with his role as a mental health provider and how he provides a mental health nexus opinion and what goes into his role as a provider when he is both treating, diagnosing, and opining as to the origin of a mental health condition. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Mundt, and hopefully we can switch the video to him. And then he will go ahead and get started. Dr. Mundt, are you unmuted in there?
I am here. Am I audible at this point?
Yep.
Terrific. Well, good afternoon, and thanks to John Marshall, UIC John Marshall. Now I have to get used to that. Thanks for hosting this. I've had a long relationship with this law school as a participant in these kind of events and a speaker, and done some instructing, and I really enjoy this cross between what I get to do for a living and the attorneys and the law students that I come in contact with. As Jillian mentioned, I'm a practitioner of mental health. I've been a psychologist now at the Jesse Brown VA Medical Center here in Chicago since 1992. And the vast majority of those years has been working in a crisis program for veterans, about 80% of whom present with trauma and the psychological sequela of that. You're going to be hearing quite a bit in just a few minutes today about PTSD as a particular response to traumatic events, a very specific response, and the criteria for that, especially where you want to be able to apply those in a claim for disability benefits from the VA. But as Jillian mentioned, I'd actually like to spend my 15 minutes or so backing up a little bit from the experience of a claim, the evaluation, even treatment, and just think a little bit more about what I think you as attorneys want to understand about psychological trauma, especially the kind of trauma that comes from war and from military service. And in that light, I'm going to be talking to you here about something that we now call moral injury. And before we even define what a moral injury is, back up still further and just think about what we really mean when we talk about psychological trauma. For your purposes, when you're representing somebody on a claim, or even if you are working in criminal law and you're needing to defend somebody against charges, there may be a matter of mitigation based on a person acting out of PTSD symptoms, for example. You're going to be thinking about PTSD as driven by events in many cases. And a trauma is an event or a series of events, But when we think about it too much as just a specific event that has very specific symptoms attached to it, we really lose sight of the fact that going through trauma is a much more holistic experience that truly changes your life. I like to use the analogy that when a person goes through a firefight or an ambush, an IED exploding, or a sexual assault while they're serving in the military, the effect of that psychologically is a little bit like getting a rug yanked out from under you. You thought you were standing solid, strong, you were going about your day. All of a sudden, something changes and nothing then is the same again. The trauma has changed your sense of safety in the world. It's changed your sense of who you are. It's changed your sense of what you can expect from other people. Trauma is experienced not just in terms of a visual, like a movie, but it's also experienced somatically through the body. It's experienced in all of the senses. And one of the most important things that I would want attorneys to understand about trauma and PTSD is that this is really not a disorder of remembering. It's not a memory problem. PTSD is about reliving and re-experiencing those traumatic events as though they're happening to you, re-happening to you, in all of their original sensory intensity. So very recently in my VA role, I was working with a young woman who went through a very traumatic sexual assault during her Marine Corps service. And when she would recount that experience with her therapist, she wasn't just sort of playing a video in her mind. She could smell the odor of this perpetrator. She could hear the music that was playing in the tent where this assault occurred. She relived it in all of her senses. So it's very powerful to think about trauma that way, because as part of your role, you're going to need to be able to talk to people about what they went through. They're going to need to be able to dredge this back up and explain it to you. But there is a cost to them psychologically of that experience, because it's going to force them to not just think about something bad, but to really relive it. And I would want you to be really aware of that there are these physiological sensations, auditory sensations, along with the visual. And that leads me very nicely, I think, into talking about a particularly severe and problematic kind of traumatic event. And that would be an event that produces what we in the VA, we in mental health, now refer to as a moral injury. And when I do a longer presentation on this topic, I usually show a Venn diagram at this point that has PTSD in one circle intersected by another circle that says moral injury. So in other words, moral injury is separate and distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder, but they very often overlap in a way that is not only very painful and very difficult for the veteran, but it also can significantly impact their treatment, and it can have a big negative impact on their ability to work through the claims process with you, or any legal process for that matter. When we talk about a moral injury, we're not talking about a psychiatric condition or a psychiatric diagnosis. This is not something you're going to find in the DSM. The closest that you're going to find in the literature out there are going to be references to something that we used to refer to as survivor guilt. It's that feeling of being somehow morally unworthy or ashamed of having come home from war, having survived war. And a lot of us in mental health saw this in many, many, many Vietnam veterans, including an uncle of mine. But moral injury is broader than survivor guilt. And it's a spiritual injury. I and others like to call it a soul wound, whereas PTSD and trauma more broadly might just be called a psychological wound or a psychological injury. A moral injury is a type of trauma that really affects this person spiritually and emotionally, very much their sense of worth. So let me talk a little more about how this happens, and I'll give you some examples of what I mean. I'm first going to tell you about a case that I was involved in a couple of years ago, involving a young Marine who had been through a number of traumatic experiences during his 3 tours in Iraq. And one of the big features of my crisis program at the Jesse Brown VA is that we practice out of what I call a hierarchy of needs model. It's very much focused not just on providing psychotherapy, medication management, group therapy, but very much on addressing the social economic problems that the veteran is presenting with. I can say quite obviously that if your therapist is bugging you to get engaged in therapy for trauma, but you have no diapers for your kid and no way to fill up the gas tank, you're going to be less amenable to trauma therapy without those resources in place. So for that reason, my team has always been very heavily involved in the process of these claims that you all are learning about today, in terms of advocating, in terms of writing letters, making sure that our progress notes are appropriately worded in VA language so that the disability is documented in a way that will ensure that people get treated fairly by the system. But this particular young man, he was doing very well in therapy, and one of my roles had been to introduce him to a veteran service officer over at our regional office to help represent him. And things were moving very, very well in all areas. And then one day, this young man just abruptly disappeared. He left treatment. He abandoned his claims process. Nobody could reach him. Nobody could track him down. His mom didn't know where he was. And it wasn't for months that I finally saw him in the hallway at the hospital. And I said, "Hey, how you doing? I've been really worried about you. What's going on?" And he agreed to sit down with me. And what emerged out of this subsequent conversation months down the road is that it was absolutely the fact that things were going so well that led this man to completely self-sabotage, to sort of destroy the process. And that was out of a very deep, pervasive feeling that he was living with, that he didn't deserve to do well. He didn't deserve to have things go well in his life, because in Iraq, he had found himself responsible for firing a shot that intermittently, that accidentally killed a little girl. He was shooting at an insurgent who was driving a vehicle-borne IED, a car bomb, towards them. He fired at this insurgent, missed the guy, but hit the little girl on the street, and that was haunting him. So even though he was in treatment for this, we were making progress clinically, and he was making progress economically in terms of the claim. He couldn't live with feeling this overwhelming guilt, and that, in essence, is what a moral injury is. So if I back up and think now, how do we get there? How does this get created? A moral injury happens when we raise a man or a woman in our culture, and they are steeped in our culture's values, our spiritual values, our Judeo-Christian values, if you want to call them that. They grow up believing in things like "thou shalt not kill" or "women and children first." Now they go into the military, and their experience in the military is also something that involves taking on a whole new value system layered on top of that original moral compass. And these values are no less positive. They're excellent, important moral values, such as you never leave a man behind, right? Your sense of duty is to this guy on your right, this guy on your left, and you have to live that honor and that duty and that discipline. But then we deploy them overseas to Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or Syria, and stuff happens. Kids get in the way. Detainees get abused because you are demoralized, you're angry, you haven't slept in days, the detainee acts out, smack them with your rifle butt. Or worse, you find yourself killing a civilian. Or you find yourself failing to prevent these kind of actions by your buddies, your brothers in arms. Now we have a person who comes home from war, who deploys home and separates from the military, who's now struggling to reacclimate to the 99% civilian culture that they're returning back to. And I learned from that case all those years ago, that young Marine, that if I don't attend to the moral injury first before I attempt standard trauma treatment, I run the risk of dealing with a person who is not going to believe that they deserve wellness, health, money, stability, sobriety, a good relationship with a partner, a meaningful vocation, and in its most extreme form, this man or woman may not believe that they even deserve life itself. And I'm going to tell you, without being too dramatic here, after 30 years now as a VA psychologist, I believe really strongly that if we want to make a dent in veteran suicide, we have to address this moral injury piece. And that is happening now in the VA to a greater degree than ever. I think almost every VA hospital in the country addresses this in our post-traumatic stress disorder clinic. We have groups that are set up for this. There is research being done on appropriate treatments for this. But I bring it up to you all here today because I want you to be aware of the potential as you're going through what seem like very routine claims for trauma, for war-related trauma, or for sexual trauma, that there can be reasons why even helping themselves complicates things psychologically for this person who may be just sort of barely holding it all together. I mentioned sexual trauma because an MST, or a military sexual trauma, if you think about it, is one of the ultimate betrayals. This is your battle buddies or your officer, somebody you trust or should be able to trust, who has now violated you. And another way that a moral injury occurs is when your sense of what's right or wrong is violated or betrayed by those who are in charge, or those who are supposed to prevent you from violating your moral compass. I realize I'm really rushing through this, and again, in a perfect world, I would talk to you about this for about an hour, and I would show you a lot of pictures, and I would present you some other cases. I know that that's not the focus for this hour. I want to mention too that there is another related experience to moral injury that we are kind of informally calling the failed warrior syndrome. And this just came up to me today. It's another psychological phenomenon that could absolutely get in the way of a veteran working with you optimally. And it's kind of related to a moral injury. And a failed warrior syndrome occurs when you've got a military person who absolutely wants to deploy. They want to be a warrior. They want to go fight. They signed up for this. They're ready to go with their brothers and sisters and do their job. But something prevents that. I know a young man who broke his ankle in the last week of Navy SEALs training and he wasn't able to go. I know a woman who was sexually assaulted on base, got pregnant, and because of the pregnancy, she was not allowed to deploy with her unit to Iraq. Both of these veterans ended up feeling less than combat veterans. They felt like they weren't warriors, that somehow they had failed at their mission. And they engage in the very same kind of sort of self-deprecating, self-defeating, even self-sabotaging experiences. So I realize I'm at my amount of time here, and I think we're ready to switch now into hearing from Jillian and from Dr. Costello about PTSD and about the claims process. I apologize, I'm going to stick around until 3, but then as they know, I'm going to have to cut out to get my son to a medical appointment. You should have my email address though, and I would be more than delighted to hear from people if you've got questions or cases. And I really do invite you to keep in touch with me down the road about this kind of stuff. We want the VA to be a partner, not just with John Marshall, but with attorneys in general. So take me up on that. And thanks for letting me speak about this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mundt. I have heard Dr. Mundt's full presentation, and I can guarantee you it is as awesome as you think that it probably is, and it totally blew my mind. So I will put his email address in the chat box if anyone has questions, or feel free to contact me, and I can get you in touch with Dr. Mundt after today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then Professor Costello and I will talk a little bit about how you might deal with these types of cases as a clinical student. So let me just make sure we're doing this right. Everyone see my presentation? Good. Okay. So post-traumatic stress, as Dr. Mundt talked about, and as you all know, this is a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. I do want to clarify, and Dr. Costello will talk more about this, that it's not just post-traumatic stress. And Dr. Mangold, I think, will touch on this as well. But a lot of people who have what we would kind of generically or as a layperson call post-traumatic stress or PTSD, sometimes the diagnosis will turn out to be something else, another mental health condition that's related. So please keep that in mind. And there are certain different ways that you might want to handle that. And again, I just want to, I didn't say this before, but if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We will take time at the end to hopefully answer some of your questions. So something that I think is really important, PTSD or PTS, post-traumatic stress, is not new. It's actually probably existed for as long as human beings have been subjected to traumatic events. This is a quote that I thought was incredibly impactful to me, actually from the Veterans Benefits Manual. We can have PTS or post-traumatic stress for non-combat and non-military related events. People in our world are walking around with PTS or PTSD all the time. In a VA or military context, it's been called shell shock, combat fatigue, war neurosis, Vietnam stress, Vietnam syndrome, delayed stress. So you may see different names on different medical records or personnel records of a veteran who served a long time ago. Because PTSD itself did actually not become a recognized mental disorder until 1980, which to me seems like not that long ago. We have a lot of veterans that I personally work with who served way before that and have been living with this for quite a long time. 1980 was when the American Psychological Association first published the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. That's pretty much the Bible for people who work in that area in terms of diagnosis and how they handle mental health treatment. So PTS, we believe, affects about 8 million American adults. I think we all know that there are a lot of people who may be suffering that don't report or don't get treatment. PTS can occur at any age, and women are more likely to develop PTS than men. There's some evidence that the potential for the disorder may actually run in families. And PTS is often accompanied by depression, substance abuse, or other anxiety disorders. You often see what are called comorbidities or co-occurring disorders, where a veteran may actually come in and say that they have a drug addiction or an alcohol abuse problem, and it turns out that there's trauma that's really underlying that problem that has not been discussed or has not been discovered. So the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, estimates that PTS afflicts almost 30% of Vietnam veterans, as many as 10% of veterans of Gulf War or Desert Storm, 11% of veterans of the war in Afghanistan, and about 20% of the Iraqi war veterans. So there are different, really different circumstances for different theater of the military and different times that people have served. So for VA benefits purposes, and I want to clarify that this is just for VA benefits for disability compensation, you have to show, sort of as you discussed earlier, you have to have these 3 elements. So a diagnosis of PTS, which for VA purposes is medical evidence that the condition conforms to the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5, credible supporting evidence of an in-service stressor, and a link between the diagnosis and the stressor, or a nexus. As you have probably discussed, there's a nexus of medical opinion that you would hopefully either get or have the VA get. And I do want to clarify, I know there was a question in the chat earlier. There was a case that the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims came out with actually last week called, I'm going to mess up the name, Yelena, after I sent it to you. I believe it's Martinez-Badone versus Wilkie, where the VA actually said that you do have to have a DSM diagnosis for PTSD in order to receive VA disability compensation. So if you have questions about that case, just know that as of 10 days ago, the Court of Appeals is still actually creating law and deciding it. So there's a lot of things that are happening in this field, and it's something that is kind of changing over time. So you're going to have these 3 requirements that you need to fulfill in order to show that your veteran is entitled to service connection for PTS. Under the DSM-5, to show a medical evidence of a PTSD diagnosis, you have to show that an individual was exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one of the following ways: directly experiencing a traumatic event, witnessing in person an event as it occurred to others, learning that a traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend, and if for an actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event has to be violent or accidental, or experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. So this may be in a non-VA context or in a VA context, depending on the case. This can be when first responders collect human remains or human bodies. They're being exposed to the aversive detail. Police officers who are repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse can actually have PTSD from simply experiencing the exposure there. So you don't have to necessarily be yourself in danger or believe you're in danger, but we know that exposure to these deeply traumatic events can actually really change you and cause PTSD. And then under the DSM-5, in order to show that the veteran has PTSD, you need to show that the veteran qualifies with these 4 experiences. So they re-experience the traumatic event or stressor. We often see this in the form of flashbacks or nightmares. They demonstrate persistent avoidance of stimuli that are associated with the event. So avoiding reminders of the event, that may mean not talking about it. That may mean not wanting to do things like group therapy or affinity groups with other veterans, because that way they can avoid even thinking about what may have happened to them in service. They may suffer negative alteration in cognition or mood, so feelings of guilt, and I think this ties really closely into what Dr. Mundt was talking about, where the veteran may feel that they did something wrong or that they don't deserve to feel like everyone else. And then they also have to show that the veteran exhibits marked alterations in arousal. So hypervigilance, when the person is over vigilant and they believe that they are threatened. A lot of the times in veterans that I work with, we'll see that with things like checking the doors excessively at night before they go to bed, or feeling as if they are on guard when they are walking around a corner or walking in a place that they don't know. They may be jumpy or something like that. And then also can be showing aggression. So someone who is overly irritable or violent or reacts very aggressively to non-aggressive stressors. Those are things that we see in a lot of veterans that we work with as well. And then Professor Costello, if you want to go ahead and take over from here and discuss a little bit about the credible evidence factor.
Sure. Jill, do you want to continue to forward the slides to, or do you want to take your screen away and I've got the slideshow on my screen? I can do it that way, whatever's easier.
I'll go ahead and click through and you can just worry about narrating what you want to talk about.
Okay. All right. So let me pick up where Jill left off and talk a little bit about the in-service stressor for the PTSD diagnosis. PTSD is the only mental health condition where you absolutely have to have a stressor event. If you don't have a stressor event, you can't have PTSD by the VA's definition. And so, and by the DSM-5 definition. The difference or the extra little piece with the VA is you've got to corroborate the stressor in most cases. Now, there's 2 distinct exceptions from that. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through the hierarchy about the exceptions and what you would need in those particular cases. So your best scenario, where you're not going to need to corroborate the stressor event. Remember, something has to trigger the PTSD, and it has to be something significant. It can't be Joe yelled at me and it upset me, or I got in a little fender bender today. Not likely to be that triggering event. It has to be the kind of event that Dr. Mundt was talking about that really causes significant an experience of imminent bodily harm or imminent death to you or someone else. And you have to be a part of that experience. So most of us luckily have never had an experience like that or internalized an experience like that, but some obviously have. So let's talk about combat first. So if your stressor event is combat or a combat-related incident, then you do not need to corroborate it. And think about that. I mean, how would you corroborate what my cousin went through in Vietnam, where, you know, how many men were killed around him, and what is he going, you know, how is he going to corroborate that? Well, perhaps he can corroborate that he was there on that particular day, but is it necessary for him to corroborate who got killed, what he saw, where he saw it, what he had to do? No. So the VA recognizes this and says, okay, for combat, don't have to corroborate. But what you do have to do is you have to prove that the veteran was a combat veteran. And that doesn't just mean they were in an area where combat was occurring. The VA defines that very specifically under CFR 3.304F, which is the CFR you're going to be looking at for these kinds of things. And the VA says you have to show that you were actually involved in combat, actually the person who was doing the killing or on the receiving end of the killing, or the attempted killing. So what do you have to do to show that? You have to prove somehow that you were there in combat. Now, how do you do that? Well, sometimes it's easy. Sometimes you get a Purple Heart or a combat citation. And so it's right there on your records. Sometimes it's not so easy, and you have to look at perhaps what unit you were in and prove that that unit was engaged in an experience when you were part of that unit in combat, or a buddy statement, or combat hazardous pay, things like that. And the next part of that is you have to prove that combat stressors were the nexus or the cause of your PTSD. Because even if you were in combat, if the reason you have PTSD is because you were assaulted by someone sexually, it doesn't help that you were in combat, because it wasn't a combat stressor that caused your PTSD. So, so moving on to the next bullet point there is that, okay, now there came about this sort of controversial place for veterans up until a few years ago, which was, okay, I'm not the actual person shooting or killing or being killed or in a position to be killed, but I'm there. I may be the clerk. I may be the medical guy or woman. I may be the person who is the cook, but every night I have to hit the bunker and Scud missiles are coming down around me. Or I have to treat someone that has a live grenade still embedded in his body, which we came across. Or I have to go clean up the carnage after an incident occurs. So I'm not a combat vet, though. I can't meet that description of combat. And so during, I believe it was during the Obama administration, the regulation was modified to say, okay, if you're not really a true combat veteran, but you are in an area which is consistent with hostile military or terrorist activity, and your PTSD is related to your fear of such activity, then you don't have to corroborate that event. So again, if I'm the person, all I have to do, it's not that easy. Because remember, the two hardest things about showing PTSD are, number one, the corroboration or the events that you must document and corroborate, and number two, the nexus, the link between what's going on now and the event that happened to you. Those are the critical pieces. So now I'm here saying, okay, I'm in an area where I'm scared to death every day that an idea is going to come and get me, you know, a car is going to blow up, or with an improvised device, or the Scud missiles are going to land, or something is going to happen, or I'm you know, going to be in a position where I'm really fearful for my bodily integrity or for those around me. So in those cases, the regulation says all I have to do is show that I'm in such an area, and then of course, when we get in a minute, we'll get to the nexus phase. So that, again, it may be easy, it may not be easy. But there's another little glitch that goes along with this regulation piece, is that when it was passed, one of the quid pro quos in Congress for getting it through was that the added requirement is that your PTSD must be diagnosed by a VA psychiatrist or psychologist. It's the only piece of the regulation that requires that diagnosis occur by a VA psychiatrist or psychologist, not the piece that would require, the others don't necessarily require that. Now you get into some other contests about one doctor says this, one doctor says that, but in order to have combat-related PTSD, or the third time I'm kind of going to talk about in just a second, you don't have to have that extra piece of having the VA diagnosis. So that makes it a little easier. If you can show that your fear of hostile military or terrorist activity causes your PTSD, and you don't then have to prove a specific triggering event, just that you were in a place consistent. So obviously, if I'm sitting on base in Hawaii, I'm probably going to not have an easy time proving that. But that I'm afraid that somehow a bomb's going to come and land on me. But if I'm in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere else where there's obvious hostile activity going on, or maybe not so obvious, but I can prove it sometimes through, for example, a diary. We had one woman who had a friend, colleague in service give her his diary where he was keeping track of the events. And then the third, I know I'm talking fast, but we do want to get a lot of information out, just scratching the surface here. The third piece, which is you have to corroborate it. That would be for any other event. I watched someone commit suicide. We were going to get deployed the next day, and I went into the garage next door and found my friend hanging there. I was in charge of training a guy on heavy equipment, and I didn't give him the right instructions. When he went to get off the vehicle moved and rolled over him and decapitated him. These are the kinds of stories that we hear where now these are not related to combat, not related to hostile military or terrorist activity. So now you've got to corroborate the exact event. You've got to have a newspaper clipping. You've got to have something that shows that that event was there and that you were there also. And so there are ways to do that. It makes it more difficult, of course. And then the very last piece of this is the military sexual trauma, which is a little, well, it doesn't only have to be sexual trauma. It can be any physical trauma. But sexual trauma, as you heard, is one of the most prevalent, unfortunately. And I believe Dr. Mangold's going to speak a bit to this, too, as to one of the areas that he sees when he does the diagnosis of PTSD. And so with a physical assault or a sexual assault, what the VA has said is that they're going to be a little less rigid about you actually having to corroborate the event itself. Because if you were listening to some of the earlier presentations, you heard that many people didn't. And especially now, you know, people are more likely to report the event perhaps than they were 10 or 20 years ago. So people rarely ever reported a sexual assault in the military. And if they did, they were often told, oh, suck it up and go back to work. You know, be a big boy or a big girl and don't worry about it. And so now people are coming, especially with the Me Too movement and other things, people are coming out and going, you know, this happened to me and I think it affected me. Look at how I've changed since this event. So what the VA now says is they look for things that are called markers. So what that means, and you're gonna, of course, in your clinics go into a lot more detail with these things, but what that means is you're looking for things that are consistent with a sexual assault having occurred. They don't prove it occurred, but they are consistent with it occurring. And so basically, and this can include stalking, it can include mugging. It doesn't just have to be an actual rape or an actual physical assault, sexual assault rather. So what are you going to look for in these kinds of cases? You're going to look for things that would be in the records of the veteran that would be consistent. The VA says you can't rely on a failure of evidence in a record. You can't say, oh, nothing's there, so it couldn't have happened. But you certainly can use things for corroboration. And things you would use would be things like visiting a clinic for counseling, getting a test for a sexually transmitted disease, having absences where you didn't have any before, seeking a transfer from the unit, maybe to get away from the perpetrator, getting a pregnancy test if you're a woman, lay statements about your behavior changing, or maybe you even told someone and they're able to write a statement of what you told them. substance abuse beginning or accelerating when you didn't have that before. These are all things that would be what we might call circumstantial evidence, or things that would be consistent. And so those are the kinds of things you're going to be faced with when you have to corroborate or say, I don't have to corroborate the stressor event, because without that stressor event, you can't have a PTSD diagnosis. Now, you can have other diagnoses, and that's what we're going to move into, and Dr. Mangold will speak a little bit to that as well. Certainly, you can have depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, many other conditions. Every mental health condition is not PTSD, and that sometimes we lose sight of, and the VA loses sight of. So with that, I'm not going to talk about rating. All mental health conditions are rated the same under the same table. And I think they talked a little bit of that earlier today, so we're not going to go there. And I know Dr. Mangold has a lot to say, so let's move on to him. And then if you have any questions for us at the end, and like everyone else, my email will be available if anyone wants to contact me personally or after the event. Certainly be happy to have any kind of conversations with you about these kinds of things. Jillian, you want to move on to Dr. Mangold?
Yes, absolutely. So Dr. Mangold is now going to speak a little bit about what he looks for and how he would craft a VA medical opinion when he, or for a medical opinion rather, for a VA case when he is looking to work with a veteran who has a mental health condition, and how he might work with the veteran, interview them, and actually put together a diagnosis. So Dr. Mangold, if you're unmuted, there you go. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to kind of fill us in on how that all works. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks Professor Costello and Professor Berner for asking me to participate today. It's always a privilege to be a part of a group that has the welfare and improvement of veterans' lives. I appreciate it. It's an honor, really. Thank you. I've been in practice for 40 years, and for the last 20, I've been writing opinions for members of NOVA. I've written about 800 opinions since I started, and it's the best thing I've ever done. I've done a lot of stuff as a psychologist, but this is the most gratifying. As an expert, my job is to establish whether or not there is a mental condition and if it is related to service. And secondly, how that affects them presently, then in terms of their limitations of social and occupational functioning that might be imposed by that mental health condition. And how I do that is that I have a conversation with the veteran. And I begin by making an effort to establish some rapport with them, explaining that I'm a veteran, and I show them this. This is me. Most of these things, except for this one here, pertain to Vietnam. And after they say thank you for your service, and I say thank you for yours, we go ahead and start the interview. And I begin by asking them to tell me about their early years. Where were you from? What was it like when you were growing up? What was it like? How many brothers and sisters did you have, and how did you get along? And were there any factors at play during those early years that might affect your ability to tolerate whatever happened to you in service? It's particularly important if there was trauma at an early age, or if you grew up in a home where there was alcohol and drug abuse, because a lot of times those things will affect how they adjust to service. The other thing I will tell them in the very beginning is that I'm familiar with their record, and that I don't expect them to come up with a lot on their own, that I've been doing this a long time, and I'll walk them through it. And once they're comfortable and they give me the go ahead, we talk. I'd like to know about your early years, and I'd like to know what it was like for you in school. How did you get good grades? Play sports? How about drug and alcohol use during school? And typically they will say, well, I used drugs a little bit, or I drank a little bit. It wasn't until after I got out of service that I really started using. And it may be at this point that I tell them I'm a recovering addict myself. And this token here I got a couple of years ago is for, at that time I had 46 years clean time. So we're going to talk about that later if it's an issue. I'm just telling you this as a sidebar, but that's a big deal. You know, a lot of veterans have drug and alcohol problems. And so that's something that the veteran and I are going to talk about later, if that's part of their thing. I want to know what their service experience was like. What was boot camp like, besides the fact that they don't say please when they want you to do something? How did you adjust to boot camp? Did you go to AIT, and where was AIT, and how did you do there? Tell me about your MOS. Were you doing okay up to this point? What was your first duty station, and how are you doing then? Maybe if it's an MST course case, maybe the MST occurred at their first duty station. Were you deployed, and what happened when you were deployed? Cases of where its initial claim for PTSD are typically more difficult than increased rating cases. If it's a brand new claim for PTSD, I have to talk more with them about their trauma, and it's difficult. And I'd much prefer doing an increased rating case, because you don't have to go into detail about their trauma. But I want to know if it is, for example, an MST case, what in the days and weeks following the trauma, what was going on with you? What were you doing that was maybe different than before? Were you just for transfer? What was it like when you saw the perpetrator? Were you in the same unit still? Or, and they tell me, well, I had to walk all the way around the base so I wouldn't see that person. Or whenever I saw him, I'd look to the ground, or I'd want to avoid him. And I got real sweaty when I was around it. This kind of stuff may not be in the record. If it's not in the record, it's important evidence to substantiate the presence of markers. The other thing is, that might have been the point when they really started using drugs and alcohol. It often is. And that continues even after they get back. And if I'm an addict, I can talk addict to addict with these guys and gals. And already I'm talking vet to vet, and now I'm talking addict to addict with them. And it's my experience that they will be more forthcoming with me once they know that we're alike on those two levels than if they were talking to somebody who didn't have that experience. I want to know, and I'm going through this real fast, like everyone's going through the presentation real fast, but I want to know what it's been like since you got back to the States. Were you able to work? Were you doing, how are you getting along with your family? Did you have a partner? Were you able to function at all with other people? Or were you changed? Tell me about it if it changed you. I'd like to know specifically what was going on. And if we get through this, and I will and tell them, you know, you've filed a claim for PTSD, so now let's talk about the symptoms of PTSD. And Jillian and Professor Costello have already gone through some of that, and Dr. Mundt knows this is true. The re-experiencing criteria, they're the toughest ones to talk about, because they'll say, I can't stop thinking about it. You know, it's like it happened yesterday. I can smell it, I can feel it. On and on and on. This is hard for me to talk about, believe me. It's when you connect with somebody on that emotional feeling level, it takes it out of you. And I'm glad I don't work with veterans on a day-to-day basis, because I'd be wiped clean. So we go through, and if we can establish the diagnosis of PTSD, that's great. I've never talked to a veteran who is also not depressed, and typically that will be a diagnosis of record, and so I don't have to go through the diagnostic criteria for depression with the veteran. If there is associated drug and alcohol abuse, we might talk about that at some length. And in MST cases in particular, I want to talk a little sidebar here. Very often veterans begin to drink in country. They discover that it's the only way they can sleep, it's the only way they can stop the memories, it'll diminish the flashbacks, on and on. And some of them come back, they quit drinking, but some of them discover they've been triggered, and now they are real alcoholics, and they can't stop drinking, and they can't stop using. Okay, once we establish the diagnostic criteria, then I say, you know, we need to shift gears there a little bit, and I'd like to know how these things affect you presently. And for this, I follow the World Health Care Organization Disability Assessment Schedule, which is abbreviated WHODAS, and it took the place of the GAF score that we used to use before DSM-5 came out. And it provides a way to assess the impact of a mental health condition on their occupational and social functioning. Because of these things, it's difficult for you to concentrate for 10 minutes or more. Is it hard for you to remember important things? It makes it difficult for you to get along with people and start conversations and maintain a friendship and things like this. And talk about those things. I never go through this so fast when I'm talking to a veteran, but this fleshes out the impairment of occupational and social functioning that the rating specialist is going to look at when they're going to assign a disability percentage. Sometimes we have to do it again, but oftentimes, but that's what we have to focus on. So we have to have again, we have to establish a diagnosis or a mental health condition. It has to be, it's my job to figure out whether it's related to service, and it's my job to figure out how that affects them currently in terms of their social and occupational functioning. If I spend an hour and a half with a veteran, I can pretty much cover all those things. And I tell them at the end of the interview, I'm going to write a report for your lawyer, and it's going to be based on what you and I have talked about today and what's in the record. And I want your lawyer to show you what I write about you, because I want you to know. And if I have got you too stirred up today, I want to know if there's somebody that you can call. If you can call the Veterans Crisis Line, or if you have a practitioner at the VA that you can call. And I want to know what you're going to do after the interview. And if they're a drug and alcohol abuser, I will say, you know, if you have a sponsor, this would be a good time to call the sponsor, or maybe there's a meeting today that you can go to. That would be great. But I don't want to leave them. And I should tell you that in the beginning that I understand that some of these questions are going to be tough, and they may get you stirred up today. But for the purposes of going through this claim, we need to do this. And at any time during this interview, you get freaked out and you need to stop, you let me know, and we'll talk about the weather or something else, then come back to it and once you settle down again. Typically, the veteran will say, I've never told anybody what I told you today. And they'll tell that to the lawyer. And it's, as I said earlier, it's been the most gratifying thing I've done in 40 years of practice, and I appreciate it very much. I got a note from Jill that I got about a minute left now for Q&A, so I'm going to shut up and let people start asking questions of them. Or anybody. I guess we're going to ask questions of anybody, not just me. So.
Thanks, Dr. Mangold. I know we had a question that Hillary put in the chat, and this is one I think that Dr. Costello and I and Drs. Mangold and Mundt could address. What do you recommend for attorneys working with a veteran who is triggered by talking about their trauma? And how do you recommend going about that type of conversation? Dr. Costello, do you have any thoughts on how to have those conversations?
Well, the one thing that we've done, it's a real simple thing, but if the veteran is really having trouble taking us through the events, we'll tell them to go home and write it down. To take a few minutes and just write it down, and then maybe we can talk about it later, or maybe they can just send it to us and we can read it and maybe follow up with some things in a context that isn't quite as emotionally triggering. So that's just a real simple thing, but certainly sometimes it'll be in the records, or we'll say, well, if you can't talk to us about it, you're seeing Dr. Mundt over at the VA, can you talk to him about it? And ask him if he would put it in his notes. And then we'll have something like that. Or if we're sending them for an outside, a non-VA evaluation, like to somebody like Dr. Mangold. So that would be the way we'd handle it. But often we just say, write it, can you write it? And sometimes they will.
Yeah. Dr. Mundt put a great thought in the chat box, that something that helps if the veteran is not working with a provider is something called grounding. Dr. Mundt, do you want to tell us a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, sure. I wasn't sure that I would have a chance to actually say to that, so I put some detail there. It depends on getting the idea that this is not about just talking about something from the past, but literally, as Dr. Mangold put it, that this is reliving this all over again. That you're going to get all of the sensations. It can be too much for some people. So we do a lot of grounding work in treatment settings to try to make sure that the person stays in the here and now. And I'm going to tell you, I put it in my chat comment, hugely helpful technique that we use regularly now is to quite literally just have a disposable cup full of ice cubes or ice chips, or even cold water will do in a pinch. And I have clients now who literally carry a cup of ice with them when they're driving, anything that they can use. And I have a Halloween candy bowl in my therapy group room where they will literally pick up handfuls of ice and hold it while somebody else in the group is going through a stressful combat event. By the end of the group, we've got water all over the floor because the ice is melting and the service dogs are lapping it up, and it's chaotic as all hell, but it's beautiful because it works. People stay in the here and now, and they can tell their story without sort of dissociating, without losing the here and now focus. And ice is a wonderful technique that you could really use easily. Can't recommend that enough because it's so simple.
I love that idea. Thanks for sharing that. My one piece of advice, Hillary, in response to this question is, if on the attorney or law student side, take your time and follow the veterans cues. I would recommend not pushing them and not saying we have to get this done today. Giving them time where it's not the first or even the second conversation you have with them, but maybe the third or fourth or fifth or seventh or 10th. I try to build that relationship with my client so they feel comfortable talking to me. Some of them, Dr. Mundt and Dr. Mangold can tell you, some veterans will say, this is what happened to me, and they'll tell me on the first time. And some of them, I don't know until months into working with them that they went through a trauma that they've not told anyone or that they don't feel comfortable sharing. So building a relationship where they feel they can trust me and that they can keep me at my word, and that they know that when I say I'm going to call them, I call them, makes, in my opinion, it has an effect on our relationship, so that they may feel more comfortable later on telling me about something very difficult that may really affect them for the rest of that day or the week or for a long time. And something I do also in that regard is, when we are about to have a conversation about the trauma, I talk to them about it and I say, do you think you're ready to talk about it? Is this a time where you can be comfortable at home or in a place where you're not, at work on a break and you have to go back in 15 minutes, and making sure that they're okay with it. And if they're not okay with it, then we talk about it a different day, and making sure that it's something that they feel that they are able to be heard, and that they're able to share what they want to share.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, it's so helpful sometimes if the veteran's spouse is in the interview. Typically, the veterans that I talk to, they don't like to talk about their anger very much, but the wife is like, hey, I can give you data from now until tomorrow because they're an asshole. And let me tell you why. I'm going to give you 25 examples of how they lose their temper and blah, blah, blah. It's like, they may not tell that To me, they might not tell it to the VA psychiatrist or whatever, but their wife, she knows.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, Hillary, I'm going to turn it back to you if we don't have any questions, but if anyone wants to put questions in the chat box or send them over to us on email, we'd love to talk. Thank you so much.
Well, there was something
Yeah.
that Matt threw out. Can I speak to that real quick in the chat
Yeah.
room? About sometimes the VA will say that certain things like, oh, a fire at a ship can possibly be a triggering event for a lasting trauma. Yes, sometimes the VA does that with many, many things, or tries to blame it on some pre-existing something that happened, not that it precipitated them. I find that the best way to address those things, frankly, is wait till it gets to the board, because the board will make short work of a stupid comment like a fire on a ship can't ever be a stressor event. Have your support from your psychologist or your psychiatrist if they will say, yes, indeed, this was traumatic for this person, and this is why I'm saying that it was. But I think, honestly, sometimes there's no hope until you get to the board.
Sad but true.
Well, thank you to this excellent panel. Thank you to both of the doctors for joining us today and for giving us your time. And also to Jillian and Peggy, we really appreciate the content that you were able to give us and yeah, learning from you. So appreciate that very much.